All right. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed your brief break in our programming. Spoiler alert, the baby did, in fact, get candy for breakfast because, that's how I parent. So wanted to take this opportunity to thank our premier sponsors, the San Mateo Credit Union, Lucille Packard Children's Hospital / Stanford Children's Health, J. Paul Company, and Stanford University. And at this time, it's my honor to introduce my good friend, fellow wild toddler wrangler, and Progress Seminar co-chair, Assembly Speaker Pro Tem, Kevin Mullin. Kevin, take it away.
Co-chair the Progress Seminar with you and the folks here at the county. It's now Chamber San Mateo County with the rebranding. I'm so used to saying the Redwood City San Mateo County Chamber of Commerce, but great to be with all of you. We have a distinguished panel to talk about some exciting political happenings in the state of California. We want to welcome you to our final panel of the annual Progress Seminar, which is designed to be a political panel, designed to dig into the issues of the day, the political happenings of the day, and hopefully provide a little bit of analysis and perspective on the political landscape in California. This is California Politics 2021, Recall, Recovery, and Redistricting, and we will get into all three of those topics. So we are honored to be joined by three distinguished guests who will help us explore all of that. We have Mindy Romero starting us off. Mindy Romero is the founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy, which is part of the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy. She is an expert on political behavior and race, ethnicity, and political underrepresentation. We also have the go-to expert on redistricting, a process we're going through right now. Paul Mitchell has joined us. His firm is Redistricting Partners. He is a data consultant based in Sacramento who has decades of experience in the arena with a particular interest in California Voting Rights Act implementation. Thank you so much, Paul, for bringing your expertise to our panel. And then finally, we have Erica Walter. She is a partner of Clean Sweep Campaigns, a San Francisco-based direct mail general consulting and online advertising firm, serving primarily Democrats and progressive causes nationally. And I should say that she has been central to multiple San Mateo County ballot measures, which have been successful. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. I want to sort of dispense with the recall fairly quickly because there's been quite a bit of analysis on that. We're actually transitioning to a discussion around how we might reform the recall process so we don't have to go through this yet again. There's a little over $400 million spent to basically rerun the 2018 gubernatorial election. Very similar results. Gavin Newsom received 61.9% of the vote in 2018, received just about 61.9% of the vote in the recall. So it was much ado about nothing in the grand scheme of things. But did any of you have any doubt about that outcome? I'll admit I was nervous for about a week when I saw some tricky polls come out that started to sort of create a narrative that, hey, maybe voters are going to take their anger about the pandemic out on the most visible face in government in California. Proved not to be the case. And we also have some results this week in Virginia, New Jersey, and some other places, which really has sort of sent a shockwave through Democratic politics, at least. So there's a lot happening here. But just in terms of the retrospective, Mindy, let me start with you. You're an astute observer of how all of this works in California. Were you ever nervous about the outcome? And any general reflections on sort of what we have come through here with the recall?
Hi, thanks for having me. Glad to be part of the event this morning. It's an interesting word. Was I nervous? No, I mean, if you run the numbers, right, he had it, so to speak, all along, or he should have had it all along. I think certainly when we saw some of the polls that were coming out mid-July into August, it did put a question mark in a lot of people's minds. And there were a media flurry in California and nationally, like wondering what all this means. And it made it look like he was really in jeopardy. I think he, in the end, did what he needed to do, which was not to blow his huge Democratic registration advantage in this state. So he had the numbers all along. It was about just making sure that nothing got bungled and that the execution came off as it should be, that he had the turnout, that he got his supporters He certainly was aided by Larry Elder being his key competition. What I was nervous about was, or at least what I'm always concerned about, is just how high turnout would be and how high or how well that pie of voters would represent the state. And we knew that, it being essentially a special election, we were expecting likely that turnout would be low. It was higher than I think many of us had expected, but it still wasn't representative, and we're still obviously doing that research to understand it better. So he won, but there's just a greater question around, who made this decision, who was a part of this, who voted, and in this type of election, we know that we didn't have a representative segment of California actually participating in it, and that's always a concern.
So, Erica, you are a campaign professional. Observations about how that campaign unfolded. Were you surprised at all at what we saw as the campaigns both cranked up? I was surprised to see Barack Obama on my television screen. All the big guns came firing, and at that point I thought there's no way that he's going to go down here. But just observations from a campaign pro who actually runs these campaigns.
Well, I will say I was nervous, for a variety of reasons. And one of them is kind of a campaign execution reason. It felt quiet to me, the campaign. Some of that certainly has to do with where I live, San Francisco. If you can't count on San Francisco in something like this, you've got bigger problems than you can even begin to deal with. So, that's definitely part of it. But I had friends who lived other parts of the state, parts that are much more competitive, who also said just not a lot of mail, a little bit of texting, not a ton, a little bit of TV, but not a ton. As campaigns go, I had several people say to me, when's the campaign going to happen? And I will say that I was worried about that. But obviously, all's well that ends well.
And Paul, you were around. You and I are considered old dogs in the California political game, I think, at this point. You saw the 2003 recall. Not many parallels here, right? Totally different universe of voters in 2003 than 2021. Did you see any parallels, or were these two distinct kind of historical anomalies, really, in how we elect governors, comparing 03 to 21?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more things that are dissimilar than similar. When we look at 2003, just looking at the raw number of voters, as you know, and have been a part of, the voter registration in California has skyrocketed. So 22 million voters, roughly 5 or more million voters than there were in 2003. So the electorate is different. The mechanics of the election, very different. We had an election where it's the second round of having everybody get mailed a ballot, and then different implementation in different counties, but largely vote centers in most counties. And so those kind of things contributed to obviously many, many, many more voters than in 2003. And even though I share Mindy Romero's concern about the electorate not reflecting the true California eligible voter population, it definitely was a lot more equitable electorate than in 2003, when there were a lot fewer registered voters among people who were renters and people who were lower income and minority groups and others. So definitely that parallel just doesn't exist between 2003 and now. The other thing that was very different about this election versus 2003, and I think the most critical part of it, is that the governor managed to figure out a way to make the recall not a mandate on his own performance, or not a mandate on COVID and other things that I think that the recall proponents were hoping. He was able to make this into a binary between himself, traditional Democratic messages, and a very, very, very strikingly conservative, inflammatory, kind of Trumpian opponent. If we had that in Virginia this last week, we would have had a very different outcome there too. So he benefited from that. He also benefited from, unlike 2003, being able to just have a simple message: vote no, just ditch the second question. In 2003, there was all this muddiness with Cruz Bustamante running in the recall, and people feeling like they had to vote for somebody, and maybe some people just kind of voting for Schwarzenegger because it was fun. And in this election, he was able to kind of make it that binary, vote no on the recall. Don't worry about those other 45 choices that you have on the second question. I think it gave permission to Democrats to, get their ballots in quickly, and made it really a blowout. And, I think that the Newsom campaign and those who are fighting the recall really deserve a lot of credit for having been able to turn that around. It could have gone sideways, and Virginia reminds us of that. If there was a point 6-7 weeks before the election where you started seeing those bad polling numbers, if we had a different composition of people on the replace side, if we had different messaging, if they hadn't been effective at making the campaign into a Democratic Republican, and it was still kind of a referendum on the Newsom campaign or on the Newsom gubernatorial years, then it could have been different. And I just think that we have to have some humility and understand that, like, what happened in Virginia, that kind of result could have happened here, something like it.
So there was a reference to the all vote by mail, just the nature of this election where every voter automatically gets a ballot. We'd like to plug the fact that here in San Mateo County, we've been a pioneer on moving to all vote by mail elections. That turned in from 1 county to 5 counties. And now with some partnership assistance from our elections chair, Mark Berman, also represents part of San Mateo County, we've taken that statewide. So just the nature of the difference when every voter gets a ballot. I mean, that alone was notifying the Democrats out there that there actually was an election coming in September, which is obviously an oddly timed election. So Mindy, just your observations, I know you followed this very closely, just the changing nature of the way elections are conducted when every voter gets a ballot, postage paid, and just the universe of voters that we're talking about here that are actually going to participate, even in an oddly timed election like this one.
Yeah, and as Paul already mentioned, with much higher registration numbers, right? That means you have all of those people that are registered automatically getting a vote by mail ballot. So, we did the research, we've done some research on the 2020 general election, and we know that 87% of everyone that voted used a vote by mail ballot. But I think it's important to note that they're not all mailing those vote by mail ballots in. So only about a third mailed their vote by mail ballot actually through the mail, old fashioned. Another almost 40% wanted to drop it off at a drop box. Another 17% wanted to drop it off at a location that was a physical location that was staffed. We'll see how as we progress, how those patterns may change or maybe somewhat go back. I'd be surprised to see how much it might, but we know that voters are responding well to not only just getting a ballot and being reminded about it, but their options and how they actually can get that ballot in and actually express their vote. And some people feel more comfortable and in a drop box because they don't want to put it through the mail. Some people need in-person services. They need, to have an accessible voting machine, language assistance, whatever it might be. And I think Californians certainly are responding well to that. But we're also understanding that many Californians aren't fully aware. Most Californians aren't fully aware of all the options that are available to them. There's still a huge need around public outreach and education. So as we were relieved to see higher turnout, no matter what the outcome was, we were relieved to see higher turnout than I think was expected in the recall. And of course, we saw historically high turnout in the general election. As we go forward, we still need to understand there are a lot of voters, particularly historically underrepresented voters, that could still need to be pulled into the election or at least made, transition from somewhat voters to always voters. There's still a lot of confidence in our election system that needs to be built amongst voters, I think now more than ever, unfortunately. So I'm not quite sure if I'm answering your question, but I'm excited to see the last few years that we've seen higher than expected turnout. But we need to still understand that there's a lot of work to be done. Santa Clara, San Mateo, your whole area there has been historically a higher turnout set of communities. But there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of making sure that everybody's a part of that process. And again, we have a representative electorate. And I think misinformation, how we talk about our elections, how much of that information is getting to everyone, right, is going to make a difference. And unfortunately, this recall, again, regardless of the outcome, still stirred a lot of misinformation in our state. We were unfortunate that we came off of 2020, right, with a hyper polarized, even more greatly polarized political landscape, and then we went right into a recall that was also very polarized, with a lot of misinformation and a lot of talk about voter fraud and so forth. So those are the things that are on my mind kind of going forward, is just to be aware, no matter if you're happy about the outcome or not happy. I'm nonpartisan, of course, in my work, as just to kind of have a real pulse on what is happening with the electorate and where people are right now in terms of their confidence and their accessibility to voting.
And Erica, just the way elections are run now, knowing that everybody gets a ballot, how has it affected your job? How has it affected the calculus when a campaign is putting a strategy together?
Definitely changed timing of communications a lot. When California first started having no excuse vote by mail, people treated quote unquote absentee voters like they were all in this homogenous pool, like everybody would send their ballot back the minute they got it. And what we now know is that definitely doesn't happen. You get a small spike at the beginning, right after ballots mail. The folks that do mail their ballot right away, a lot of those folks are older, not all of them, but a lot. Then you get a long trough, because obviously since ballots are out for a full 30 days, there's quite a long period between when they mail and when election day is. So the small spike all comes the first week. You get a trough in weeks 2 and 3 where very, very few people vote. And then you get a huge spike at the end. Like Mindy said, a lot of people are dropping their ballots at polling places, or, rifling through piles the weekend before the election going, where did I put that thing? And, obviously those of us on this Zoom are probably a little bit more politically active and involved than most folks. For most people, this is not a top priority. So most folks do vote definitely in the last week. But what it means for campaigns is that you have to be live with your communications for a lot longer period than in the olden days, where everything kind of led up to the last 2 weeks before the election. You have to stagger your communications so that you reach those people who vote early, but then you don't want to send mail, for example, to those people who have a ballot but aren't going to vote until later. You want to reach them right before they're voting, because frankly, they're not going to remember something they were sent 3 weeks before they vote. So short plug for PDI here, that does the best data in the state. One of the great features there is that there's individual tracking by voter of when people vote, whether you vote early, mid, or late. Humans are creatures of habit. So as a general rule, if I'm somebody who returns my ballot the day I get it, I'm going to do that again. If I'm the guy rifling through the piles on Monday before the election, I'm going to do that again. And so that individualized data allows us to communicate with voters at the time that they're actually going to vote. And it's priceless.
So Paul, I subscribe to your data tracker that tracks ballots that have actually been returned and from where, which counties. It's an amazing tool for those of us who are political junkies. But just different patterns that you've observed as the way we are voting has evolved here. Just sort of lessons, I guess, from just observing the way ballots come in, what people who are paying attention to this stuff actually look for, that gives little indicators about what an outcome of an election might be, sort of how that works. And what is the changing nature of the voting and the ballot return process like in California now?
Yeah, Erica really hit it. And one of the things I like talking about sometimes when it comes to this is one of my favorite old movies was The Candidate. And I feel for like young political people who are going to go and watch this great old movie about a U.S. Senate candidate in California running for this upstart campaign. Not only are all the phones plugged into the wall and everybody's smoking in the campaign office, it's the 70s, but also they'd probably be getting stressed out because it's 3 weeks before the election and they're not getting people's ballots mailed in. They're not actually doing turnout. They're following this ancient arc of early fundraising and debates and TV interviews. And then all the actual activity was a big buildup to, when the sun rises on the Tuesday morning and everybody goes out and knocks on doors and gets people to go to the polls. Very different arc of the campaigns back then till when, versus now when you have this month-long campaign. And like Erica said, the patterns of voting, there's certain people who vote early, certain people who always vote late. We did have this like strange, complete polarization of that in 2020 when the Trump campaign basically messaged all their voters, don't trust vote by mail, and go to the polls, don't mail your ballot early. And almost reflexively, Democrats are like, wait, Trump's telling us not to mail our ballot early. We better mail our ballots early. So they were doing this thing of like signaling, Democrats signaling by putting up on Instagram the picture of them dropping their ballot off at the drop-off box, and Republicans signaling by, going in person to the polls because we don't trust those, postal carriers are going to change our votes and all this weird voter fraud stuff. But watching that data come in is definitely kind of a favorite pastime or addiction for a lot of people in California. It's sometimes hard to understand what exactly you're seeing until it's all over. And Mindy does a great job after the election cycle of really unpacking the patterns of voting, the types of voting people were doing, whether they're doing the drop box, the in-person, the mailing, and really kind of figuring that out, because there are implications for campaigns, and not just for political campaigns trying to get their candidate to win, but also for groups that are just interested in expanding the California electorate and interested in making sure that everybody is kind of coming out a winner, not just in their candidates winning, but in their vote being effective and in their vote mattering. So there's a lot to be learned from this. California is really ahead of the curve on this when you look nationally, and shockingly, New York just defeated a ballot measure that would make no excuse vote by mail available in that state. Some states have more vote by mail than previously, but California really is a driver on this. And I think it's improved our elections. And I hope that I guess we know now that this will continue for years to come, thanks to the work of the legislature.
Yeah. That's interesting, Paul. I didn't hear that about New York. But on Paul's previous point to his final point, Mindy, about the shape and nature of the electorate, just a final thought, and then we'll move on. But a final thought about the nature of the demographics of who's actually turning out, who's actually sending a ballot in. With this all vote by mail, are we seeing an electorate that more closely mirrors the population as a whole in California? Are we seeing the needle move with regard to minority voter participation, those kinds of things? I know you track this closely.
Thanks. That's a great question. And I should say too, Paul has been a fantastic data partner of ours. And so some of the numbers that I just presented a little while ago on the 2020 general election were at least in part informed by some of the data Paul gave us. So thank you, Paul. Since everybody's talking about how fabulous his data is. We've done, so there's just the numbers, right? Descriptive statistics, right? Who votes and what percentages and so forth, right? The share of the electorate. And then there is, a more complex analysis to really understand, did these reforms, for instance, vote by mail, as you're asking me about, did they increase turnout, but did they actually narrow the gaps, right, that we see in turnout by race, ethnicity, age, and other, demographic statuses, right? And we know that in 2020, we saw, again, historically high turnout. We know that there are also a lot of different factors that play in terms of why we are seeing such higher turnout really over the last few election cycles, including the national, very much so the national political landscape. So I just want to say at the outset, it's hard to disentangle all this, but I have done some research with Eric McGee of the Public Policy Institute of California, the ongoing research looking at this question around vote by mail and if it actually increases turnout. And we did find in 2020 that California and nationally, states that had what we call universal vote by mail, where you automatically mail that ballot out, there was an increase. There was a larger jump in turnout for states that, when controlling for many other factors, in their turnout. So in other words, bottom line, vote by mail appears to have an impact on turnout itself. Right now, currently, and very soon we're working on, and very soon we'll be coming out with new research to address that equity question. So did it actually help close the gaps? So I just as a little bit of a sneak peek, the bottom line is a complicated picture. It depends on what group you're talking about. There are some pluses and some minuses. And again, that work will be coming out pretty soon. But it reminds me, and what I'd like to remind everybody is when you talk about a reform, Did it increase turnout is one thing, and that's hard to do. Again, disentangling, you usually have to look over many election cycles to really fully understand it. But also, even if it increased turnout, is it really making a more representative electorate? And I think we've got some early data to tell us that it does for some groups and not so much for other groups. But we're still on the early end of this to really understand. And as I mentioned earlier, just from our own survey research in California, we know that most Californians aren't even fully aware of all the options that are available to them. So in that sense, there's still a long way to go in terms of really like fully implementing options, models like the Voters' Choice Act, right, that we have in Santa Clara and San Mateo County, which involves automatically mailing a vote by mail ballot, but vote centers and other services as well. So we're still on the early end of people like being fully aware and the outreach and education that's needed, in a sense, to give a full or true test of some of these reforms. Hopefully that makes sense.
So let's transition to talk a little bit about the pandemic, just where we are economically in California, the mood of people as we're in a quote unquote economic recovery. For a lot of folks, I imagine it doesn't feel like a recovery. We thought we were coming out of the pandemic, then the Delta variant hits. It feels like it's just kind of people may be numb to this at this point. We're not quite through this. It's affecting potentially the president's poll numbers, which has a trickle down effect to maybe the governor's races we saw this week, what might happen in 2022 in California. So a lot is in flux here, but what is your sense, and whoever wants in on this, feel free to jump in. You don't need my cue, but just the mood out there that you're sensing, or even your own personal feelings about sort of where we are in the economic cycle here and how that might affect, say, the 2022 elections coming up. I just know anecdotally among my friends, there's just this kind of fatigue that we're not quite back to where we need to be. And how does that ripple through sort of the political structure? How might this affect or shape or put shade on the 2022 elections? And you can, if you want to reference what happened in some of these off-year elections this week, feel free to do so, because I think it is a little bit of a warning sign for certainly for the folks on my side of the aisle, for Democrats.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly and say I think the supply chain stuff, which is pandemic related in a way, right? Some of it is, some of it isn't. But I think whether it is or isn't, I think people perceive that it is. It worries me, right? I mean, for better or worse, and mostly worse, it's that we're a pretty consumeristic, materialistic society, and people not being able to get the Christmas present they want or whatever they think they need right this minute, let alone things that really are essentials like toilet paper. I worry about the political fallout from that. I think that that may have had some impact on the elections this week. I don't think it was the primary factor, but I think if the supply chain issues don't get worked out soon, and obviously the administration is trying to do that by keeping the ports open 24 hours and a number of other measures, but I feel like that really contributes to people's grouchiness, and I'm worried about the holiday season in particular.
Want in on that?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the what's going on with the economy and the supply chain and all that, but thinking about the election going forward, I think there is kind of a either there will be or either there won't be kind of conversation that we can be thinking about for 22. And by that, I'm really talking about the is the election going to be what I think we would likely expect? An election that is a referendum on the Democrats who now control the White House, both houses of Congress, and any frustrations with the economy or the supply chain or, other COVID and other issues that are going on, and that becomes the driving factor for the election. And generally, that's bad for the party in power. You've got a history of these midterm elections after the party changes in the White House, and particularly party changes in the White House and Congress at the same time. Then it's kind of a reflexive back to the other party in that midterm election. Add to that, just as we're going to talk about in a little bit, redistricting. Having this midterm election happen in a first year after the redistricting can create even more turmoil and make things even tougher for campaigns. But then the will there won't be kind of question, I think, really is around will we be able to see this election turn on other issues? Many people on this call know that my wife is the CEO of California Planned Parenthood. I just say that as a disclaimer because I think that choice is one thing that could be a driving factor in the 22 election if Roe v. Wade gets overturned in this spring. If we go into the spring, summer, and Roe v. Wade gets turned over, and there's other things that are going on that can allow this election cycle to be kind of polarized on those kind of issues, rather than being a referendum on, the economy or gas prices or how many gallons of milk people are buying at the store every month, then I think we can have a different kind of election. That's kind of what Gavin Newsom showed. Maybe he got lucky, but he was able to show the ability to be successful on core Democratic issues when that's when the voters are kind of looking at. And that's something that Terry McAuliffe didn't show, which was the ability to create that polarized election around those core Democratic issues. And he got caught up in being more of a referendum on the establishment in DC and the current party in power. So we could see Democrats have a really tough election cycle in 22. I think we probably should see that. That's probably the more likely thing, but there are also possible kind of external events that could reposition the way that voters are thinking about the election.
Yeah. I mean, certainly historically, it would appear that this is going to be a difficult cycle for Democrats. But Mindy, you wanted in on that.
Oh, I'll make it short. I was just going to certainly agree with everything that's been said. There's still an eternity between now and the midterm elections, right? Primary and general. We just have to keep that in mind. Get through certainly the holidays. I agree with some of your concerns around the holidays. Americans and their presence, right, and their consumerism. But we have something, what's happening right now in the House, right? Today, Biden's infrastructure bill, the social policy and climate plan. He desperately needs wins. The Democratic Party desperately needs wins. We'll see, in a few months how all of that plays out and how people are responding to it. So there's a lot of factors that I think are in play, but certainly the Democrats have reasons to be concerned. And of course, COVID is what happens with COVID going forward in the next year. And we can't discount either.
And then just final question on the pandemic and its influence in politics. It seems that Gavin Newsom actually made some positive political hay, if you will, over his managing of the pandemic. As controversial as it was, certainly initially, he was able to, I think, double down, showing that we take science seriously and was really focused on controlling the pandemic and taking some fairly aggressive measures to do that. And that actually wound up polling pretty well. So are there enduring political lessons from a pandemic, or is a pandemic so unusual that you really can't draw many sort of political lessons from it, just given the unique nature of dealing with something where certainly for months there, nobody in government really had a strong handle on how serious and how broad this was going to be. There's more coherence now, but certainly in the early stages, there was a lot of chaos just trying to get our hands around it. But any enduring political lessons on how the governor managed it and what other governors, chief executives across the country might need to do the next time they're confronting something of this nature?
Don't go to the French Laundry. Just kidding.
Boil it down to that.
I think that part of what the governor's campaign did was run towards the COVID issue, basically say that, he's for masks, he's for vaccinations, he wants to get schools back running, he wants to get businesses to open. But again, that also might have had to do a lot with the fact that he was running against a candidate who was basically anti-mask, anti-vaccination, and he was able to create a separation between himself and Larry Elder and get himself on the side that voters were on largely in California. And what's really interesting, in fact, is that if you look at the election results and line it up to vaccination rates, it's amazing. The independents and the polling, they didn't really, I don't think, come out publicly with this until afterwards. But the polling essentially was that, overwhelmingly independent voters who are vaccinated were voting no on the recall, and independents that weren't vaccinated were voting for the recall. And so it was something that he was able to, but I want to make it clear, I think that if it wasn't Larry Elder and if it had been Kevin Faulconer, and Kevin Faulconer and he didn't have a big separation on, say, just masks or vaccinations, then it could have been a referendum on how exactly the businesses and schools weren't opening, the fights with the teachers, and these other things that weren't necessarily the turf that Gavin Newsom would have wanted to fight on. It could have been about the French Laundry and the other things, as Erica was hinting at. So are there lessons to be learned around the country from the way that Newsom handled it? I think the biggest lesson that people can take away nationally is try to get a Larry Elder you can run against.
And I'll just add something there. And I certainly agree. I think Newsom was given this gift of Larry Elder, right? And the strong showing that we saw in the recall for him wasn't necessarily a product of how popular he is, right? It's also voters not feeling that might have voted the other way. Some voters, at least, that didn't feel they had a viable choice. So it doesn't necessarily reflect in that sense. And then the thing that I think just to add to Paul about the national landscape, you have to remember that California is a very different state. We are a blue state. The Democratic registration advantage is, huge here. And how we felt about many policies, including COVID, is very different here in our state. Not for everyone, as we know, but very different, for instance, versus very different set of circumstances. If you want to compare California to Virginia, for instance. And so governors around the country are, threading that needle in many cases in states that aren't, solidly red or solidly blue. And Newsom had a much easier time in that sense, not only from the registration advantage, but because of how people were polling and feeling about. So he really, like I said earlier, I think he didn't bungle, but it could have been closer. But he had a lot of advantages in this race that other governors don't have. And it's not necessarily a fair comparison by any means to talk about what happened with Newsom and then to go around the country and compare that to other situations.
Yeah. So moving to our next topic, redistricting. Paul, this is your bailiwick. It's wonky. It's maybe not very sexy, but if you're involved, well, I know. Sorry, Paul.
I think it's sexy.
What? If you're into politics and care about elections and care about democracy, this is such an important process that California is going through at this point. Well, states across the country are going through it. Communities have their own redistricting commissions. In California, we have the California Citizens Redistricting Commission, totally insulated from politics. It used to be the job of the legislature to draw districts, congressional, legislative. Now it's in an independent commission. Paul, can you give us just a little background on the commission? Just the sort of top lines on what this process is all about right now. And California might lose a congressional seat, which if it's ever happened, it certainly hasn't happened for a long time. Our population usually grows. So this has really changed the nature of how this map and all the puzzle pieces fit together. And what might it mean just for the political system writ large as we come through the map drawing process here?
Well, that's a lot of questions, but I'll start off by saying that, the commission process that we have in California really is the gold standard around the country. And it's one that is somewhat being replicated in local governments. I'm proud to have worked with Mindy with the Long Beach Independent Redistricting Commission, which is modeled after the state process. There are other agencies we're working with commissions or redistricting committees. Probably about a dozen agencies we're working with, cities and counties around California, are utilizing some type of system like this. And even local governments that aren't, we're working with 80 local agencies around the state. And even those that aren't using a commission or an advisory committee are still changing the way that they're doing redistricting. It's front facing, it's public engagement. We're not doing any redistrictings where, it's like, backroom line drawing kind of stuff. It's all really changed. The whole temperament around redistricting has changed because of this commission, and the expectations the public has changed because of this commission. The commission was created and implemented in 2010, 2011. The process is not partisan political. There are 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents. they're selected through this crazy process. It's like a chutes and ladders kind of process with applications and interviews, and literally a step where they bring in the bouncy ball thing from the state lottery and like select randomly commissioners who are highly qualified, researchers, academics, a couple that are kind of more mathy, a couple that are more community organizing types. There is not a red-blue kind of partisanship here, but there is kind of a focus on, some of the Voting Rights Act issues and kind of the social justice and some of that element within the commission process, ensuring that districts are drawn in a way that are effective for minority communities, effective for those who are generally disenfranchised in the election process. Very, very, very different than what would be happening otherwise. If we didn't have a commission, I'd be getting the call from Tony Atkins and Anthony Rendon and Gavin to go like in some back room and smoke cigars and draw lines. And not saying I wouldn't want to do that, but it's not good for the public. It doesn't benefit anybody but politicians. And so it's really an amazing thing that we have with the State Redistricting Commission. And was done so well in 2011. It's going so well in this cycle that other agencies and states are trying to emulate that. And I just think it's great for democracy to take this out of that, self, politician incentive, gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering kind of environment and put it back out into the public. There are still things that need to be done, even especially in local redistricting. The city of Los Angeles redistricting that I worked on, as they did their final report, they put out a statement that I 100% agreed with, which is that city council redistricting in future years should be a fully independent redistricting process, one that isn't council members, texting their appointees to tell them where to move lines or, things like that. Just a fully independent process is what we want to have in these commissions going, into the next decades. Now, you mentioned in California, one of the big top line things is that there's going to be a loss of a congressional district in the state. It is the first time the state has lost a congressional district. It doesn't mean that California didn't grow. We grew by 6.1%, but it means that we didn't grow as fast as the rest of the country. And so basically, Texas gets Elon Musk and one more member of Congress out of California. And we'll have to make do with 52 congressional seats, still the largest delegation in the country, obviously. Yeah. The impacts of that, in one sense, you can think about it. If we have 52 congressional seats and we just lost one, each district has to grow by 2%. So each district has to take in that extra 15,000 voters or whatever, 15,000 residents in order for all districts then to kind of rebalance. But that's an oversimplification because some districts were already overpopulated. Other districts are underpopulated. And we see in particular in the LA County region, a bunch of districts all kind of next to each other that are all underpopulated. And so when people talk about where is that congressional district going to come from, one way of thinking about it as well, it can come from LA. Just the first draft that the commission put out of the visualization had all the districts, and you could look at them and go, okay, that's that person's district. That's that. Oh, okay. Where's the Karen Bass district? And it literally disappeared a black district out of the middle of LA. They've since put that district back in, which I think is probably in the commission's best interest to make sure that they're not eliminating a minority district in a state that lost a congressional district because we lost 5% of our white population, that the commission doesn't say, oh, okay, California, you lost 5% of your white population, you lose a congressional district, let's get rid of a minority district. So I think that isn't going to happen, that the districts in LA that are Latino and Black Voting Rights Act districts are going to be fairly protected, and that the loss of a congressional district will probably come somewhat more from the outskirts of LA and LA County. But the impact of that for Californians, I mean, we still have 52 members of Congress, still the biggest delegation. We still have the Speaker of the House in California. And if there was a flip where Republicans took control of the House, we'd have the Speaker of the House still from California, just from a very different district and a very different partisanship and ideology, but still California is going to be the most important part of, the congressional delegation with 52 members. And it shouldn't impact us that much in terms of the state's kind of prominence around the country.
So
the
maybe,
other redistricting, I'm sorry,
Go
you
ahead,
want to?
Paul. No, I was just gonna, Paul, if I could just jump to Mindy real quick. I was curious if she had been following that LA situation, and just Mindy, if you think, as an observer of this commission, that it really is a national model that others follow and localities can follow. And then Paul, I want to come back to you for your final thought on that process. And then I'm going to ask Erica about how this changes running campaigns. You don't even know what the maps look like in your planning campaigns, so that's tricky. But Mindy, your thoughts on LA and just the commission in general?
Well, certainly first with the commission, I think it's a national model. I think just factually it is in the sense that people have been, citing California and it's part of a lot of conversations around the country in terms of what makes sense for other states. It's not perfect. Even now, the commission that is seated, there were a lot of concerns during the process of actually identifying and selecting the commissioners. As Paul did a great job of, I think he's covered most everything that I would want to mention. Certainly, the process is quite extensive, but even then, there were concerns ultimately about that process and how representative the pool of voters was and the recruitment process itself. So, but it's. What I'm encouraged about is what I've seen and I've noticed others have observed as well is that the commission this time around seems to be really untethered from the past, at least what we're hearing kind of publicly. They seem to be very willing to, in a sense, start from scratch. Generally speaking, of course, there can be negatives like LA and what Paul mentioned in terms of LA, but that's a good thing to be less kind of encumbered by what has come before. And that really is what the process is supposed to be about. So I think that's positive. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah. And Paul, back to you for your final thoughts. And I just wanted to ask also, what does this portend, this whole process? Retirements, when you have districts getting redrawn, you have members being thrown together in the same district. So it just creates a lot of turbulence, right? Until sort of the dust settles and you see what this actually looks like, right?
Yeah, I don't want to give you or any of your colleagues in the legislature any more anxiety than you probably already have about the process. But this redistricting is probably going to be just as, kind of stressful as we go out of the line drawing process into the actual implementation of the elections. Because a couple things. One is in 2011, before the 2012 election cycle, we had 12 members of Congress retire. We are not seeing that level of retirements. I mean, we can look around at some members of Congress who are older and they seem very focused on staying where they are and not, stepping down anytime soon. In 2012, there were a lot of assembly districts that got moved or Senate districts that got moved and people who got paired in with other people's districts, but about 30 plus members of the assembly were retiring, plus a handful of state senators were retiring. And there were those congressional seats that they could go up and run for Congress. So there were outlets for this shakeup that was happening after 2011. There are not as many outlets. There are 0 members of the assembly that are retiring right now because of term limits. That's just because the change in the term limits law, essentially giving each member 12 years in their house. That change in 2012 means that people elected that election year have until 2024 before they're going to be termed out. And so you don't have this natural shifting because of term limits that's going to happen. So as these lines shift and 2 members get drawn in the same district, there's not going to be an ability for one of them just to go run for an open congressional seat or open Senate seat as much. The other thing that's going to happen is that you're going to have this coming so much later than in 2011 redistricting. The late census means that this process isn't going to be finalized until December 27th. The filing date originally, before the legislature changed it, was I think December 15th was the date you could open up and file and start getting signatures for the signatures in lieu. So it really is putting the redistricting cycle right on top of the of the election cycle. And so if there are line changes that negatively affect state legislators and put two legislators in a district, there might not be avenues for kind of avoiding, head-to-head contests or some other kind of negative things coming out of it. So we'll see. I think that Mindy is right that this commission is kind of forging their own path. But at the same time, in the last few days, they've started to kind of thinking more about like, well, maybe these districts were put together by the last commission based on community of interest testimony and rational reasons. It's not like 2011 where we were drawing a map on top of what was a gerrymander for decades. Maybe we can use more of the existing structure, the existing lines, where it's suitable. There still are places where they are kind of blowing up the boxes and reinventing these districts, and I think they're doing it to make these districts a lot better from the public's perspective. We'll see how well the incumbents and the campaigns like them.
Yeah. Well, I know some of my colleagues have moving companies on speed dial at the moment.
I talked to an elected official who was in a actual U-Haul moving truck, and I was like, "It's too early. What are you doing?"
Yeah, right.
Not just
like you move
I'll
after
just
the
say,
redistricting. You don't move before the redistricting.
to your question
not just the
about
line.
how it affects politics, I mean, I think the biggest thing right now is just that everything is just frozen, right? Because people understandably don't want to run for a district that they don't know what the district is, or even in some cases, whether they're going to live in the district. And what the partisanship of the district is and all the rest of that. So right now, it's just everything's kind of in this weird hold pattern. And then when the dam breaks, it's just going to be absolute chaos.
I'll add something there too. And by the way, add to that just what the moving costs are, right, in each potential district, right? Going along with Paul's joke about the situation. I was talking about the untethered nature of the work of the commission. I do want to emphasize, we should talk about it here. The public's ability, right, and what really the process requires the public to be actively engaged with the commission. It does seem that the commission has been really open to what the public testimony is, but there needs to be more, right? There needs to be more engagement as much as possible with the commission. And it's a great process, but it only works as ultimately, right, as intended, as much as there is engagement in that process. So I want to encourage people that might be listening and be interested in what is really a sexy topic, redistricting, and also a critically important topic. If you're not involved, get involved, and not just at the state level, but as Paul mentioned, I know around our state and beyond, and the local redistricting process is also incredibly consequential. So public engagement is absolutely necessary.
So
and a shout out to one of our clients. The city of San Mateo was the first one in the state to utilize the Fair Maps Act this redistricting cycle. They just completed their redistricting, an open, fair, transparent process that literally ended with a coin flip. So you can go watch their hearing. It ended them making their final decision by flipping a coin. So that is transparency when you get to watch them for 10 minutes stumbling around trying to figure out who has a quarter.
Wow. Nice plug for the city of San Mateo. Be interesting to see which side of the coin landed and where those maps actually wind up. But we have just a couple of minutes here. I wanted to, since we touched on sort of citizen engagement more generally, just a question around democracy in general and what's happening in California versus other states across the country. I never thought voting, the mechanisms of voting, would be so political. I don't think they should be political or partisan, but you actually have fear about elections officials in other states really like looking at election results, actual votes, and not certifying them, not accepting them because they don't comport with their own political persuasion. I mean, this has become such a political conundrum, voter suppression, laws making it harder to access voting and balloting, versus California, which is really moving in a completely different direction, opening up the process, creating more access, making it easier than ever before. So do any of you see this being resolved in some way at the federal level, either the Supreme Court or Congress actually taking this issue up on the federal level to create sort of an overlay of federal protections on voting rights? Or is this going to continue to be like a state-by-state battle? And just kind of where is this debate going? And you also got the social media component, disinformation campaigns around just fraud, say, which is minuscule when it comes to voting by mail, but that is used as a political cudgel out there. Where is this whole conversation going? Is it a state-by-state deal, or might we see some kind of federal intervention to sort of stabilize the perceptions, at least, of voting and voting integrity?
Well, I mean, Republicans in the Senate blocked the John Lewis Act for the fourth time on Wednesday. So that's where that is in terms of federal legislation. I mean, there's been a lot of efforts to try to, there was an original bill, and then Senator Manchin was not a fan. And I think Democrats knew they couldn't pass it without all of our people, at least. And so there's a revised bill, but now the revised bill is being blocked. So as you say, this has just all gotten very politicized, and it would be incredible if there could be federal legislation, but I guess I'm not holding my breath.
And I'd be afraid that federal legislation even would resolve this. I mean, it's really tough to put the genie back in the bottle and get people back to where they kind of believe in and have faith in the mechanical parts of our democracy. And it's sad to watch. In California, I feel like we've been fairly inoculated from it. We do have members of our own congressional delegation, a couple who in the last election cycle, doubted the validity of the election and questioned why, late votes were swinging towards Democrats, but then they didn't complain in 2020 when those late votes swung towards Republicans. It's like a cancer, and it just keeps spreading. Even in redistricting, we talk about California, this gold standard of the redistricting process around the country. This is a process that was created by Republicans. This is this process that we have. Charles Munger, a major Republican donor, was the architect of that chutes and ladders thing I talked about with the process for selecting these commissioners. It is a national model. It is something that Democrats now embrace, and it is a good reform that we should have around the country. And right now, who is out there attacking it? Some of the people who were proponents of it, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And you have people who even at the national level in the redistricting space, they're questioning this communities of interest. They're like, who are communities of interest? What is this? It's like a conspiracy. But the reality is that we can try to create these better structures, and we can try to create a better federal reform around voting rights. But we have to figure out something else to get that change back in the culture where we can all agree that the results of elections are real, that the elections officials are, doing a good job, and that they're not, trying to skew elections. And we do that here in California. A huge number of our county registrars around the state are Republicans. And then there's some county registrars who are Democrats and some who are independents. But you can take the Orange County registrar and the LA County registrar and line them up, and there wouldn't be a thing they would do differently in election administration and what they believe in and about the access to ballots, the access to voting, the ensuring everybody's vote counts. And it just should not be a partisan issue. It should be something that all Americans come up through our school system believing in, that we can understand and have faith in. And I don't know that just a bill is going to fix it. It has to be something in our culture.
I know you're at the end here, so I'll be really quick. I absolutely agree with both Erica and Paul, and especially the long-term multi-pronged approach. It's not as simple as a bill, and it's incredibly unlikely at the federal level. I will say that For all the positives here in California, we also, I'm sure Paul knows as well, many local election officials, county election officials that have been threatened, that continue to be threatened, that are harassed every day. This is real on the ground, right? Even in our state as well. Misinformation, distrust, hatred, anger. What I will say is I think it's going to continue. I think we're in it for the long haul, unfortunately. I do see a light at the end of the tunnel. The political sociologist in me has to. But I think the key factor is when it stops becoming a political advantage. So elected officials will continue and others continue to promote the big lie and misinformation and distrust and all the things we're talking about, as long as it continues to be fruitful for them politically and economically for many of them as well, right? So just that to me is the bottom line equation.
And we have one question from our viewers coming in, and then we'll wrap. I just want to make sure I don't ignore this. A discussion around district elections for all agencies, even down to the sewer board level. I'm a proponent of district elections, but you have some jurisdictions that are so small that it may be difficult to recruit certain candidates given the size of the district if they're too small. So I think that's the sort of essence of that question from Judy Taylor. She's requesting a state law that provides the foundation for the lawsuits with regard to moving from at-large to district elections. But just any thoughts on the move toward district elections? This is a real thing. It's happening right now in San Mateo County in terms of how districts are getting drawn. So you've got the redistricting process happening in some cases concurrently with drawing actual districts for the first time. So this is a real sea change, and certainly you're seeing it on the local level and in counties across the state. Just any thoughts on how district elections are working in a broad way, and might there be a need to have some kind of a floor, just given the small size of some jurisdictions where districts are being implemented, and just sort of the byproducts of the process?
Yeah, so on the conversions, so I mentioned that we worked with San Mateo. We're really proud to be working with them on a conversion process where they went to districts. We're also doing that with Burlingame right now. They've got an incredible process, a ton of outreach. They even have dog toys, like little redistricting dog toys, which are cool. That's like the swag of the redistricting process so far this year. And so that we're in Redwood City transitioned recently. We're working with them as well on their redistricting. And this has been happening around the state. There are big and large agencies that have been getting caught up in this conversion. A little bit of trivia, one of the smallest agencies in the state that has districts has had districts for a long time before the CVRA. The city of Bradbury, with 1,000 people, has districts, and I think in some elections, like 132 voters in a district or something like that. So you do have some small agencies that are already in districts and have them functioning. We did have one agency contact us, a community services district that has 400 people in the entire district. It has 192 voters. They are one precinct. They are not going to be able to convert to district elections, but the law doesn't provide an avenue for them to be immune from a potential lawsuit from somebody who claims that their elections are racially polarized and they need to convert. So we do have some agencies that come to us, and you can do kind of look at like, well, maybe this law isn't really meant for you, but there's not really an escape valve for the really small agencies either. Some agencies like the San Mateo Harbor District, where we did a conversion a few years ago to districts, a huge agency, but also kind of an obscure agency. I hope nobody at that agency would be offended by that. But, getting candidates to run for a harbor district isn't necessarily always easy. And so maybe in some of these agencies, there's fear about getting candidates to run. Overall, the CVRA has done a monumental job at diversifying the candidates that are running for office, geographically, ethnically, age groups, different kinds of people running and being able to win. In some agencies, it makes elections less expensive because you're just running in one district rather than citywide. It allows for a different pool of candidates, and it allows voters in districted structures to be more effective at electing a candidate of choice, whether it's an Armenian community, a Chaldean community, an Asian or Black or Latino community, or a renter community, or a student community, it allows them to have more voice in a district around their area than they would in an agency-wide or city-wide election. So overall, I think the CVRA and the conversion process has been fabulous. There are some agencies where you might kind of go, oh, well, maybe this law wasn't really meant for them. But the way it's tailored, there aren't really ways for them to avoid that conversion. But we haven't seen any agencies, just for the record, that started off as highly functioning, wonderful governance, and then went to districts and immediately became dysfunctional. And we haven't seen agencies that were, crazy dysfunctional and went to districts and everything just worked out. And now all of a sudden they're perfect. There are things outside of the district process that do influence those elections and their governance. But overall, we look back at the districts that we've worked at over the last dozen years that have converted, and we see, for the most part, a more representative government coming out of the district elections.
I'm happy with letting Paul have the last word on that, particularly about the importance of voice and representation. So,
Me too.
And this is, I promise, the last question. It feels like we've become more polarized over the last decade for a variety of reasons. Is there any polling or political history that may indicate that polarization will decrease? Polarization is a huge issue. We only have like a minute left, so feel free to punt on that, and we could bring it up next year, since I don't think we'll solve the problem. But is there any polling to suggest that maybe the pendulum has swung toward a polarized electorate now, and it may swing back naturally to a more common good sort of focused politics? Or are we down that lane, and it's going to be a long, long time before we reestablish sort of a center in our political life? Good luck with that one.
Unfortunately, not aware of any such polling. Not aware of any such polling. I wish I was. Maybe we could make some up.
We could get some next panel, political historian. I'd love to hear it.
Well, I did say a moment ago, I don't have the full answer either, but I did say a moment ago that I'm optimistic as a political sociologist about in the long term, the light being at the end of the tunnel. And part of that is that we do ebb and flow, but I think this particular time is also unique in the level of, not necessarily the level of anger, but with social media, some of the damage that can be done and is being done, not just to individuals like election officials, but certainly to our overall democratic process and the stability of our democracy. So I think we will get to a better place, but it's not because, if I dare, you said natural, it's not just because it'll happen. And I know you're not suggesting it exactly like that, but I think we have to do the work. And all of us having a reaction, many of us here, I'm sure on this call right today, even having a very strong reaction and a strong set of concerns around what is happening now will be part of that kind of process as a society and as a democracy to hopefully get us to where we need to be. I don't think it'll naturally happen, but I think we will get there. But just what damage along the way, right? Is
an optimistic note and a challenge for all of us. So Mindy Romero, USC, Paul Mitchell with Redistricting Partners, and Erica Walters with Clean Sweep Campaigns. Honored to be with all of you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise with us today. We'll see you soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And with that, we have reached the end of the 52nd Annual Progress Seminar, the second year we have met virtually. I hope you found these sessions thought-provoking and insightful. Thank you for making the time to attend. Let me thank my Progress Seminar co-chair, San Mateo County Supervisor Carol Groom, Roseanne Faust with SAMCETA, and Julie Lynn with the San Mateo County Central Labor Council. Special thanks to all the sponsors who make all of this possible. And finally, a big thank you to the Chamber San Mateo County staff, Amy Buckmaster, of course, the ringleader here, Maggie Fahey, and Felicia Vasquez for all of their hard work to make this possible. We look forward to seeing you all in person April 29th through May 1st, 2022 at the 53rd Annual Progress Seminar. Have a great day. Good to see you all.